If there's any scene that epitomizes Chicago's North Shore, this is it. A summer night at the Ravinia Festival in Highland Park. Wine and cheese by candlelight, the strains of Beethoven or Ellington or Gershwin drifting across the lawn. Historian Michael Ebner called the North Shore a genteel enclave of affluence, culture, and high society. I'm Geoffrey Baer, and in this program, I'll take you on a tour of the North Shore. You'll see examples of the upscale lifestyle you'd expect to find here, but you'll also see and learn about a lot that might surprise you. Like shipwrecks and a great train robbery and a Nazi prisoner of war camp, all on the North Shore. You'll hear great gospel music at an African-American church in Glencoe, find out who invented the jungle gym, and why Evanston gave the world the ice cream sundae. You'll meet the rich and famous and the not-so-famous. You'll visit multi-million-dollar lakefront estates and architectural treasures like the Baha'i House of Worship, Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie-style homes, and modern masterpieces. Join me for a tour of the North Shore and more. One of the unique things about the Ravinia Festival is that it has its own train station. That's actually not so surprising when you learn that a railroad created Ravinia Park as a way to build ridership. In many ways, the entire North Shore as we know it today is a creation of the railroads. The first railroad on the North Shore opened for business in 1855. It was the Chicago and Milwaukee, later called the Chicago and Northwestern. It transformed the journey between Chicago and Waukegan from a slow, bumpy stagecoach ride taking a day or more into a relatively comfortable 2-hour trip. It was the industrial age, and boomtown Chicago, like 19th century industrial towns everywhere, was becoming crowded and filthy and dangerous. Many people were ready to escape. The railroad gave them an easy way to do so. It was the birth of today's North Shore. The entire North Shore and the city of Chicago were almost in Wisconsin. But when Illinois was granted statehood in 1818, the border was moved 62.5 miles north so the new state could have a little bit of Lake Michigan shoreline. We'll start our tour up near the Wisconsin border at Illinois Beach State Park, where the lakefront still looks the way it did centuries before humans settled here. We'll work our way south, exploring the lakeshore suburbs and the suburbs that border them to the west. We'll end our tour at the edge of Chicago in Evanston. Here at Illinois Beach State Park in Zion, you can still see the North Shore the Native Americans knew for hundreds of years before white settlers arrived. Low dunes, sandy oak savannas, marshlands. In the 1890s, the Illinois National Guard established Camp Logan here. Military marksmen trained on the rifle ranges for 80 years. FBI sharpshooters trained here until the 1970s. Today, Camp Logan is gone without a trace, replaced by the native terrain as the Illinois Indians knew it in 1673 when the first explorers arrived. Explorer Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit priest, were taking a shortcut home to northern Michigan and Canada after a successful journey to explore the Mississippi River. For the next 100 years, the North Shore area was frequented by French-Canadian fur traders doing business with the Native Americans. By the time the U.S. government set up Fort Dearborn at the mouth of the Chicago River in 1803, the Illinois Indians were gone and the Potawatomi dominated the region, including the North Shore. But a treaty signed in 1833 banished Native Americans west of the Mississippi. According to the treaty, the government paid 14.5 cents an acre for 5 million acres. They then sold that land to settlers for $1.25 an acre in 40-acre parcels. Now, settlers weren't legally allowed to move to the North Shore until 1836, but there were scattered settlements here before that. One of the oldest was Little Fort. Today we know it as Waukegan. It started in 1695 as a French trading post. By the early 1800s, Little Fort was a small, bustling industrial town. Lake County was formed from McHenry in 1839. Just a year after that, ambitious Little Fort snatched the title of county seat away from Libertyville, which at that time was called Independence Grove, thanks in part to a possibly exaggerated census taken by a Little Fort booster named Captain Robinson.
Within 10 years, the population boomed to 2,400. Since Little Fort was no longer little, it changed its name to Waukegan, the Potawatomi word for fort or trading post.
Waukegan served as a port city, shipping farm products to Chicago. Remember, this was in the days before there was an easy overland route to the city, but that would change soon enough.
The morning of January 13th, 1855, was cold and dreary, but spirits were high in Waukegan. The largest crowd in the city's history assembled for the opening of the Chicago and Milwaukee Railroad. Chicago Mayor Levi Boone was on hand. The president of the railroad was Walter Gurnee, himself a former Chicago mayor. He was about to make one of the first fortunes in North Shore real estate.
You see, he located the train stations adjacent to land he owned all up and down the North Shore. Gurnee's property became Lake Bluff, Highland Park, Glencoe, and Winnetka.
Gurnee came to Chicago in 1836 from Haverstraw, New York, where his father was a wealthy tanner. Here, he established the highly successful Chicago Hide and Leather Company. Then, he started buying land.
Gurnee found himself at odds with executives of his own railroad. He had a vision of bedroom communities all up and down the North Shore served by commuter trains, which would take passengers to and from the city every day. His colleagues thought the money was in hauling freight. After all, these bedroom communities only existed in Gurnee's imagination. In the end, they overruled their boss and ran freight trains.
That actually worked to Waukegan's advantage. The town was too far from Chicago to be considered a suburb. Freight trains helped it continue to develop as a regional industrial town. Waukegan struggled with declining industry starting in the 1970s, but it's still a blue-collar town with dreams of revitalizing its downtown. The diverse population is about a third Hispanic, a third white, and 20% African American. Jack Benny is Waukegan's most famous native son. He was born Benjamin Kubelski in 1894. He dropped out of high school to play violin in vaudeville shows. Author Ray Bradbury was born in Waukegan in 1920. He revolutionized science fiction by focusing more on humans than hardware. His best-known works are The Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451. Walter Gurnee may have been the father of the North Shore, but to find a place that's named for him, you have to leave the shore and go about 5 miles west. Hundreds of thousands of people go there every year, but not to learn about Walter Gurnee. Gurnee, Illinois is home to not one, but 2 of the biggest tourist attractions in the state. One of them is Six Flags Great America. I'll tell you what the other one is in a minute, but first, some facts about Great America. It covers 300 acres. Its designer was a Hollywood art director named Randall Dewell, who created the scenery for such films as Singin' in the Rain and Blackboard Jungle. The trademark double-deck Columbia Carousel is the largest and most expensive carousel ever built. The park opened with 3 roller coasters. It now has 12. Many set records when they were built, but you have to be a true aficionado to understand them. For example, Batman from 1992 was the world's first inverted outside looping roller coaster. Raging Bull from 1999 was the world's first hyper twister roller coaster. Vertical Velocity, which opened in 2001, uses linear induction motors to launch riders out of the station at 70 miles an hour. Park employees have retrieved dentures, hearing aids, and artificial limbs from underneath this one. A family of 4 can easily spend more than $200 on a day at Great America. If you have some money left to burn, you can head to Gurnee's other big attraction, Gurnee Mills. The mall claims to have drawn almost 24 million people in 2001, which would make it Illinois' #1 tourist attraction. The design reflects the rural Midwest. The entrances were inspired by silos. Mother Rudd's Tavern was built more than a century before nearby Great America and Gurney Mills. But it was located here for the same reason, because this old country crossroads was about halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee.
Stagecoach service to Wisconsin began in 1836 with the ouster of the Indians. Inns like this one sprang up all over the North Shore to serve road-weary travelers on the long journey between Chicago and Milwaukee. Around the time of the Civil War, the Mother Rudd House became a stop on the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves to find their way to freedom in Canada.
Now, let's go back to the lakefront and find the place where band leader John Philip Sousa led outdoor concerts. No, it's not Ravinia. Sousa was the band leader at Great Lakes Naval Training Station. He led 14 different bands, totaling 1,500 musicians. Thousands of North Shore and Chicago residents came to his concerts at Ross Field. With the closing of Fort Sheridan and Glenview Naval Air Station, Great Lakes is the last operating military base on the North Shore. And what an operation it is. It's the Navy's largest training center and its third largest base. It's also the largest military installation in Illinois. This is where Navy recruits go to boot camp. It opened in 1911. World War I broke out just 3 years later. By the end of the war, 125,000 sailors had been trained at Great Lakes. The base was a boon to the small industrial suburb of North Chicago, which established a saloon district to serve recruits despite the town's official motto of no saloons. The Romanesque and Italian Renaissance-style buildings are now landmarked. Chicago architect Jarvis Hunt designed them. Great Lakes broke the Navy's color barrier in 1944 by training and commissioning the first 13 African-American naval officers. A building on the base was dedicated to them in 1987. One reason North Chicago became the home of Great Lakes Naval Base is because Lake Bluff didn't want it. Rowdy sailors just didn't fit with the town's origins as a family-oriented summer resort. Methodist ministers founded the Lake Bluff camp in 1875 in the small town of Rockland, where Walter Gurnee had tried and failed to develop a railroad suburb. Lake Bluff was billed as a Christian camp free of alcohol and gambling. Families could stay in tents, cottages, or hotels, breathe fresh lakefront air, and attend cultural meetings modeled on the famous Chautauqua Camp in western New York State. Turns out the camp's founders had better luck than Walter Gurnee when it came to developing the land here. They sold lots and even built cottages to finance their camp. A few survive today. Meatpacker Gustavus Swift built 2 summer cottages here. Years later, Philip Danforth Armour III, the grandson of Swift's rival, built this 60-room English manor house called Tangley Oaks on 200 acres. The family of 4 had 26 servants and 15 bathrooms. Today, Tangley Oaks is the international headquarters of the Paterno Wine Company. Another Armour grandson, Lester, commissioned architect David Adler to design this Lake Bluff mansion on 72 lakefront acres. Adler was a favorite architect of Chicago's upper classes. He was adept at creating any historical style his client wanted. This is one of his few colonial-style homes. You might recognize it as the house used in Robert Altman's film A Wedding. Adler built his own country home in Libertyville. Today, it's the David Adler Cultural Center. Lake Bluff had grown into a full-fledged commuter suburb by the time the camp closed around 1900, but it retained a modest Midwestern character compared with some other North Shore communities. For example, Lake Bluff's lawnmower drill team probably wouldn't cut it in Lake Forest. But all modesty aside, the largest single piece of lakefront property on the North Shore is in Lake Bluff, an estate on 22 acres. In 2002, it went on the market for a new record asking price of $25 million.
One of the largest train robberies in American history happened just a few miles west of Lake Bluff, here in tiny Rondout. The mastermind was a corrupt Chicago postal inspector named William Fahey.
He recruited a couple of Chicago gangsters and the Newton brothers from Texas. They'd robbed more than 80 banks without ever firing a shot. On June 14, 1924, two of the gang put on railroad workers' overalls and slipped aboard a train that was carrying $3 million as it left Union Station in Chicago.
When the train got here to Rondout, the bandits pulled their guns and forced the engineer to stop. The rest of the gang was waiting nearby in a car. They subdued the guards with formaldehyde, but in the darkness, one of the Chicago gangsters confused Doc Newton for a member of the train crew and shot him 5 times. The Newton boys rushed their wounded brother to a doctor in Chicago, who treated him but then told police. Soon the whole gang was arrested. All served time. The stiffest sentence went to Fahey, who got 25 years. The Newton boys claimed they never got a dime from the heist, but $100,000 of the more than $2 million stolen were never recovered.
Just west of Rondout is Lamb's Farm in Libertyville, a workplace, residence, and social community for more than 250 adults with developmental disabilities. It started as a pet shop in Chicago with 12 employees. Founders Corinne Owen and Robert Therese wanted to create an alternative to traditional sheltered workshops. Today, Lamb's Farm has a petting zoo, hay rides, miniature golf, and a restaurant. Probably the most famous farm on the North Shore was located a little west of here, Hawthorne Melody Farm. A generation of North Shore kids remembers taking field trips there to see the working dairy operation. Hawthorne Melody milk trucks were ubiquitous on the North Shore. Today, the farm is gone, replaced by sprawling subdivisions and Hawthorne Mall. But the farmhouse is still there, and it may be the fanciest farmhouse ever built. It's now a museum called the Cuneo Home, after its last private owner, John F. Cuneo. He was a gentleman farmer, philanthropist, and founder of the Cuneo Press. Architect Benjamin Marshall designed this 30-room mansion in 1914. Marshall was himself a Chicago socialite. He created the Drake and Edgewater Beach hotels and swanky apartment towers for Chicago's elite. The mansion is a Venetian-style fantasy, featuring a skylit great hall with a grand staircase. There are 2 formal dining rooms, a private chapel, and an indoor pool with marble walls. The 75-acre grounds include a lake, formal gardens with fountains and statuary, a conservatory, and a private 9-hole golf course. The place looks like it was built for royalty, but in fact it was built for Samuel Insull. Insull was born in England, but he was that peculiarly American kind of royalty, a crown prince of capitalism.
Like the dot-com millionaires of the 1990s, Samuel Insull made his fortune in a newfangled technology, electricity. And like a 21st century corporate scandal, he overextended his empire and it collapsed.
Insull was born in London in 1859. His boyhood idol was Thomas Edison. Edison launched Insull's career by hiring him as his personal secretary after Insull moved to America at age 22. By 1892, he was president of the Chicago Edison Company. He rescued that struggling company by buying up all of its competitors and creating Commonwealth Edison, which supplied all of Chicago's electricity. He also bought and consolidated all of Chicago's L lines. He shut down their power plants and turned them into Commonwealth Edison customers. It was a brilliant scheme, and Insull repeated it across the Midwest, consolidating hundreds of electric companies and trolley lines. Here's where his connection to the North Shore begins. In 1916, Insull bought a struggling trolley line that ran between Waukegan and Evanston and renamed it the North Shore Line. Within 2 years, Insull introduced direct service from Chicago all the way to Milwaukee. He hired artists to create glamorous advertising posters and piped opera music into the cars by radio, but traveling to Milwaukee through suburban streets was slow. So Insull bought up vacant land in the Skokie Valley to the west and built a second route. That line greatly reduced the travel time to Milwaukee. But it wasn't the riders that Insull was interested in. In his memoir, Insull wrote that interurban electric trains were acquired to develop the rural countryside into populated suburbs, which would need to be supplied with electric power. Insull ran the power lines along his own Skokie Valley right-of-way. They're still there today. The Depression ruined Samuel Insull. His empire had been financed by scores of mom-and-pop investors all over the Midwest. They saw their life savings wiped out. Insull became a despised figure, sort of a scapegoat for the Depression. He fled to Paris, then Greece. Eventually, he was arrested at sea and returned to Chicago to stand trial. After all that, he was acquitted of all charges. Insull retired to Paris, where he died of a heart attack on a subway platform in 1938. The North Shore Line lived on until interstate highways finally put it out of business in 1963. The old Spanish-style stations were torn down or remodeled for other uses. The tracks are gone, and in many places, the old train line is now a bike path. Unlike Samuel Insull, most of the North Shore aristocracy lived close to the lake. Perhaps the most aristocratic of all the lakefront suburbs was Lake Forest. No less an authority than F. Scott Fitzgerald put Lake Forest in the same league with Newport, Southampton, and Palm Beach. Fitzgerald made several visits to Lake Forest to court a local debutante named Ginevra King. She spurned him in real life, so he captured her in his novel, The Great Gatsby, where she appears as Daisy Buchanan. Lake Forest's first millionaires were puritanical Protestants with New England roots. Edith Rockefeller, daughter of America's richest man, married Harold McCormick, son of the famous farm implement maker. They built Villa Turicum. America's second richest man, Chicago meatpacking heir J. Ogden Armour, built Melody Farm on 1,000 acres in Lake Forest. The driveway was 2 miles long. Today, it's Lake Forest Academy. This enormous lakefront estate was a wedding gift from the president of Marshall Field's, John G. Shedd, to his daughter Laura in 1915. She married a banker named Charles Schweppe. The U.S. ambassador to Cuba, Noble Brandon Judah, modeled his house on a French Norman country inn. David Adler designed this Greek revival house for a newlywed couple. The groom's father was A.B. Dick of Lake Forest, who invented the mimeograph machine. He stumbled on the idea in 1884 while he was experimenting with wax paper and went into business with Thomas Edison. Unwincea Country Club was the North Shore's most exclusive. It hosted nationally recognized golf championships, polo matches, horse shows, steeplechases, and hunts. And then, of course, there was Mr. T. The star of the 80s TV show The A-Team bought Twin Gables, which David Adler had designed for Lawrence Armour, and over a 2-week period in the spring of 1987, he deforested the 7-acre property. Mr. T often wielded the chainsaw himself, cutting down more than 100 oaks, maples, and pine trees. The local paper called it butchery, and neighbors used words like desecration. The actor told reporters he was allergic to trees. Thanks to Mr. T, you can't cut down a tree on your own property in Lake Forest today without a city permit. Mr. T no longer lives in Lake Forest. The home's present owner plans to replant the trees. For all its exclusivity, Lake Forest had modest beginnings as a college town. Presbyterian ministers established Lind University here in the 1850s, named for the school's benefactor, Sylvester Lind. He was actually the minister's second choice. They turned down money from their original benefactor after discovering he made his fortune distilling whiskey in Cincinnati. Lind University eventually became Lake Forest College. The ministers also rather uncreatively named the town after the forest to the west and the lake to the east, and they hired a St. Louis landscape architect named Almer and Hotchkiss to lay out the town. Like the planners of other North Shore suburbs, Hotchkiss chose to follow the natural contours of the ravines and forests, creating roads that wind through town with what the Michelin Guide to Chicago calls calculated leisure. Like anyone else, people who lived in mansions needed hardware and groceries. To serve those more mundane needs, a working-class area grew up along the railroad tracks in Lake Forest. Some of the businesses were owned by African Americans, like Samuel Dent's Livery Service. Lake Forest's present-day First Baptist Church can be traced back to the African Americans who worked as local merchants as well as live-in servants on the estates.
Lake Forest is about as far as you can get from middle-class suburbia, so it's interesting that one of the cliches of suburban life, the shopping center, was arguably invented here in 1916. If only today's shopping centers looked like this.
Howard Van Doren Shaw designed Market Square. He was already a successful and respected architect when he was hired to transform the unglamorous area around the Lake Forest train station. According to authors Arthur H. Miller and Shirley M. Paddock, it was the first ever town center designed around the automobile. Critics raved about the understated design that mixed Tudor, arts and crafts, and neoclassical elements. The innovative plan resembled an English town market. Shaw built his own home in Lake Forest. He called it Ragdale. The arts and crafts style design reflects his love of nature. Today, it's an artist's retreat founded by Shaw's granddaughter. The monsters of the Midway would seem an odd fit in polite Lake Forest, but the Chicago Bears have made their home here since 1979. Their new Halas Hall and pristine practice facility opened in 1997. It's named for Bears founder and legendary head coach George Halas. Astronaut Jim Lovell lives in Lake Forest. He commanded the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission. Tom Hanks played him in the movie. Lovell flew a total of 4 space missions, including the first journey to leave the Earth's gravity and orbit the Moon, Apollo 8. After leaving the space program, Lovell became a business executive and Lake Forest restaurateur.
Just south of Lake Forest is the first new community to be built on the North Shore in 100 years. Fort Sheridan, developed with not a little controversy after the base closed in 1993.
Each town bordering Fort Sheridan was interested in how the land would develop and who would get the lucrative tax revenues. Lake Forest bowed out of the deal after being assured that the land on its border would become property of the Forest Preserve District, including 190 acres for a golf course and the lakefront bluffs. Highland Park and Highwood split the rest between them. They set strict zoning and historic preservation standards to protect the 145-acre National Historic Landmark District on the grounds. Lakefront officers' houses were restored. Barracks became condos. The stables are now townhomes. Fort Sheridan home prices range from $220,000 to $2 million. The history of Fort Sheridan can be traced to the Haymarket Riot of 1886. It was a time of tremendous labor unrest in Chicago. After the riot, nervous Chicago industrialists called in the army for protection, and they were shocked to find out that the nearest troops were in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Business leaders wanted a permanent military presence closer to Chicago. The elite Commercial Club of Chicago bought the land and donated it to the federal government. The 1st Regiment arrived at the fort on November 8, 1887, just 3 days before the execution of the Haymarket anarchists. At first, the fort was called the Camp at Highwood, but it was renamed for General Philip Sheridan, a Civil War veteran who kept the peace in Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871. The young architects, Holabird and Roche, were hired to design the fort. They would become renowned builders of Chicago's famous skyscrapers, but this was their first big commission. It probably didn't hurt that Holabird's father was responsible for hiring the fort's architect. The cream-colored bricks used in the Romanesque-style buildings were made on-site from local clay. The barracks are uniform and Spartan. Officers' houses increase in size based on rank. The soaring water tower and parade grounds provide space for military pomp and ceremony. The tower's arched base is large enough for a marching platoon. The fort was used for its intended purpose exactly once, when President Grover Cleveland ordered troops from Fort Sheridan to deter labor unrest at the Union stockyards after the 1894 Pullman strike. Fort Sheridan's soldiers fought in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and Lakota Indians were imprisoned there after the Battle of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Cavalry officers were glamorous characters, and the post became a social hub on the North Shore, hosting balls and receptions at the Officers Club. The fort's 20th century mission was mostly recruitment and training, but Nazi prisoners of war were interred at Fort Sheridan during World War II. In fact, Fort Sheridan administered prisoner of war camps all over Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where a total of 15,000 German prisoners of war worked in civilian construction jobs and harvested crops. The fort controlled Nike missiles during the Cold War and sent soldiers into battle in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. It was closed as part of military downsizing in 1993.
We're in Highwood now, just south of Fort Sheridan, and for about 100 years, this was one of the only places on the North Shore where you could do this without getting arrested. Cheers.
Fort Sheridan gets a large part of the credit, or the blame, for Highwood's reputation. It was once a burgeoning railroad suburb. Its leading citizen was the prominent architect of Chicago's famous water tower, W. Boyington. But when the fort opened, Highwood changed its name to Fort Sheridan Village and approved the sale and consumption of alcohol. According to historian Michael Ebner, Highwood's trustees claimed that this was the only way to get control over the many illegal drinking establishments catering to soldiers.
There were feeble attempts to clean up the town's image. In fact, in 1904, it changed its name back to Highwood. That didn't change the fact that there was one bar for every 80 residents compared to 1 in 250 for Chicago. In 1905, mayor/tavern owner Michael Gibbs went on a reform bender. He closed down a local brothel and he banned gambling in bars. Shortly after he made that pronouncement, a local minister showed up at Gibbs Tavern with members of the Northwestern University football team and had the mayor himself arrested for allowing gambling in his own bar.
Italian immigrants started moving to Highwood in the late 1800s. They were stonemasons and gardeners in the old country and found plenty of work building and landscaping North Shore mansions. According to a local historian, the Italians also made their own wine. Before long, some local Italian restaurants opened up, and the rest is history. To this day, many consider Highwood the restaurant capital of the North Shore. There are dozens of restaurants packed into a few blocks. Many have been passed from one generation to the next. Today, Highwood continues to be a port of entry for new immigrants. The town now has a large Hispanic population, and the development of Fort Sheridan has sparked a boom in real estate values. If you go a few miles west of Highwood on Half Day Road, you'll cross the Des Plaines River at about the place where the very first non-native settler in Lake County built his log cabin in 1834. Daniel Wright had been a captain in the Vermont militia and fought in the War of 1812. Potawatomis helped him build his home near their village. He called the settlement Half Day. Now, most people on the North Shore will tell you the road and the settlement were named because they were a half-day's journey from Chicago. Not so, according to the Lake County Discovery Museum's Diana Dretsky. They were named in honor of Indian chief Aptakisik, who lived nearby. Aptakisik's name is a Native American word for middle of the sky or half day.
He apparently got his name because he performed a task in half a day that would take an ordinary person an entire day to complete. He spoke eloquently against the treaty that banished his people from the area. Ultimately, his words fell on deaf ears.
Daniel Wright died at age 95 in 1873. This rock, which used to mark the spot where his cabin stood, was moved in the 1990s here to Ryerson Woods, west of Deerfield. This was once the vacation retreat of Edward L. Ryerson, chairman of Ryerson Steel. He and his friends built rustic cabins here. Today, it's a 550-acre forest preserve. The Ryerson's Greek Revival mansion from 1942 is now the Visitors Center. The oldest surviving building in Lake County is lovingly preserved in Deerfield. It's the Casper Ott log house from 1837. The Otts were early Deerfield farmers from the Alsace region between Germany and France. The Ott House is part of a little collection of historic buildings that were moved here. There's also a replica of a Little Red schoolhouse where local fourth graders spend a day each year learning how their counterparts went to school on the North Shore a century and a half ago. One very old grave in the Deerfield Cemetery belongs to John Kinsey Clark. He was a buckskin-wearing frontiersman who was raised by Indians and became a Pony Express rider between Fort Wayne, Chicago, and Milwaukee.
Deerfield at one time was called Cadwell's Corners. It was named for a family that came here from Vermont. The name was changed in part because deer were so abundant here. Well, they still are. In fact, all up and down the North Shore, seeing a deer in your garden has gone from being a novelty to being a nuisance. This is because the deer habitat is shrinking due to suburban sprawl, and their natural predators have been eliminated. Suburbs have tried everything from deer relocation to deer contraception without much success. Some suburbs have even resorted to hiring sharpshooters. It remains a hot topic all over the North Shore.
At certain times of the year, Deerfield also is overrun with bulls, but no one is trying to get rid of them. The Chicago Bulls practice at Berto Center here. It's named for Sherry L. Berto, who was Bulls owner Jerry Reinsdorf's longtime assistant.
Two ghost towns once stood where Highland Park is today. The first one died of natural causes. The second one was killed by our old friend Walter Gurnee.
The story starts in the 1840s when some enterprising settlers started building a small industrial port city called St. John's, about where Fort Sheridan is today. They built a long pier, but no one could get there by land. The nearest road was a quarter-mile away. Within a few years, St. John's was abandoned. In 1853, Port Clinton was established just south of St. John's. The developer, Jacob Clinton Bloom, built a pier and connected it by a plank road to Half-Day Road. Soon he had a successful port shipping lumber and grain to Chicago. But when Walter Gurnee ran his railroad through town, Port Clinton was doomed. Gurnee insisted on putting the station near his own property to the south. That's why downtown Highland Park is here today, and Port Clinton is gone.
As I mentioned earlier, Walter Gurnee had a vision for the North Shore, and it wasn't in lumber and freight shipping. He envisioned the commuter suburbs that we know today, and he set about to make his dream a reality. He sold 12,000 acres to a developer who started building homes from designs found in pattern books.
In the 1890s, wealthy Chicagoans turned the lakefront areas of Highland Park into a sort of summer retreat. They built large homes and country clubs. In 1900, the glamorous Hotel Moraine on the lake opened, adding to the aura of Highland Park as a summer resort.
But historian Michael Ebner writes that Highland Park was always more middle class and inclusive than some of its other North Shore neighbors. The most obvious example of that was that Jews were welcomed here, or at least not excluded.
In 1901, 4 Jewish families built a cluster of summer homes and a clubhouse here and named the resort Wildwood. Since Jews couldn't join most country clubs, they built their own, which attracted more affluent Jews to Highland Park and Glencoe. Sears president Julius Rosenwald built a huge summer estate near Ravinia in 1912. At one time, he was Chicago's richest man and biggest philanthropist. He founded the Museum of Science and Industry and gave enormous sums to Jewish and African American causes. By the 20s, homes were winterized and Highland Park became a year-round commuter suburb. Highland Parkers loved their ravines and bluffs and hired prairie-style architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright himself, to design homes that harmonized with nature. Wright's Ward Willets house was built in 1902, 6 years before his landmark Roby house in Hyde Park. It was his clearest expression yet of the prairie style, with its low horizontal lines and its connection to its natural surroundings. In the 20th century, Highland Park embraced modernism. This beautiful home from 1959 by Ernest Grunsfeld III not only foreshadowed the future of design, but also of North Shore real estate, because an earlier mansion was demolished to make room for it. Today, the teardown phenomenon is widespread and causing controversy all over the North Shore. The most extreme example, according to one local realtor, was a 1920s lakefront home in Winnetka purchased by a dot-com millionaire for $12 million and demolished. When the technology bubble burst, the owner sold the vacant lot at a $2 million loss. Many suburbs are now working on laws to discourage teardowns or at least limit the size of the homes that replace them. The acclaimed Steppenwolf Theater Company started in the basement of the Immaculate Conception Church School in Highland Park. Founders Gary Sinise and Jeff Perry graduated from Highland Park High School in the early 1970s. During the summers, they put on plays here with actors they met at Illinois State University, including John Malkovich and Laurie Metcalf. The company moved to Chicago in 1980, and many of the ensemble members are now international stars. One of the most famous people on the planet also lives in Highland Park, Michael Jordan. No, that's not his address on the front gate. By the way, Jordan's former boss, Jerry Reinsdorf, is also from Highland Park.
And then, of course, there's Elijah Gray. Never heard of him? Well, if his timing had been just a little bit better, he'd be a household name. You see, Elijah Gray of Highland Park invented the telephone. Unfortunately, he invented it at exactly the same time as Alexander Graham Bell. Applications from both inventors arrived at the patent office on the same day, and you know whose envelope got opened first.
But don't feel too sorry for him. He went on to co-found the Western Electric Company. Ravinia, just south of Highland Park, started as a Baptist religious colony, but it was annexed to Highland Park in 1899 and became something of an artist's colony instead. Maybe it was the wild terrain that attracted painters, sculptors, writers, and architects like landscape designer Jens Jensen. Julius Rosenwald and others hired Jensen to preserve the rustic beauty of their property. Jensen's use of native plants and natural terrain became known as the prairie style of landscaping. Jensen also liked Native American council rings. One can be seen in Jens Jensen Park, across from the train station. The Ravinia Festival, with its classy concert season, would seem to fit right in with the arty atmosphere of the town. Some of the world's greatest artists have performed here, from Artur Rubinstein and Jascha Heifetz to Igor Stravinsky, Leonard Bernstein, and George Gershwin.
But Ravinia Park wasn't originally a concert venue. It was an amusement park built by the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railroad.
It opened on August 15, 1904. Advertisements called it the highest class amusement park in the West. Alcohol was strictly forbidden. Attractions included baseball diamonds and grandstands, an electric swing, a casino and dance hall, and a toboggan slide for wintertime. Classical music came to Ravinia 2 years later with the New York Symphony conducted by Walter Damrosch. When the railroad went into receivership in 1908, a group of North Shore citizens led by Louis Eckstein bought the park. Eckstein introduced an era of fully staged operas featuring the greatest stars of the age. Ruth Page was the choreographer. During the Depression, Eckstein paid $200,000 out of his own pocket to cover the park's debt. He said, "Some people have a yacht. I have Ravinia." The Depression economy finally did close down the park in 1931, and Eckstein died in 1935. But his friends reopened it in 1936 as the Ravinia Festival, summer home of the Chicago Symphony. In 1949, the original pavilion burned, but the show went on. Concerts were held in a 33-ton canvas tent designed for B-29 airplanes. A new pavilion, seating 3,200, was built in 1950. The Ravinia Theater, now called the Martin, is the only original building still standing. Architect Peter Weber mixed arts and crafts and Spanish styles with beautiful art glass and prairie-style details. The 1970s brought rock concerts. Janis Joplin's performance for 25,000 fans put an end to loud rock music at Ravinia. And jazz has always been a mainstay, too. Benny Goodman, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie all performed here. More than 600,000 visitors enjoy Ravinia every summer.
We're in the Skokie lagoons now. Feels like a real back-to-nature experience, but actually these lagoons are man-made. The word Skokie is Native American for big swamp, and that's what was here until the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps drained the land and dammed up the Skokie River to create these lagoons.
During the Cold War era, there was a Nike missile base on one of the islands in the lagoon.
By the way, we've now crossed from Lake County into Cook County, which is named for Daniel Pope Cook, one of the people who was involved in that effort back in the early 1800s to get the Illinois border moved 62.5 miles to the north so that Illinois could have a little Lake Michigan shoreline.
The lagoons are a small part of the Cook County Forest Preserve District, which manages more than 68,000 acres in all. That's 10% of the land in Cook County. The forest preserves were envisioned by some forward-thinking people about 100 years ago who correctly predicted that sprawling development would someday wipe out most of what nature created here. In 1916, after 10 years of legislative and court battles, Cook County began acquiring woods, grasslands, marshes, and savannas. At the northern end of the Skokie lagoons is the 385-acre Chicago Botanic Garden. The Michelin Guide to Chicago calls the garden Noah's Ark for plants. Some superlatives. There are 1.5 million plants and 75 acres of water, 23 specialty gardens, and 3 native habitats. 800,000 people visit every year. Programs include children's and adult education and horticulture therapy.
The gardens were envisioned by William A.P. Pullman of Lake Forest. Pullman was the head of the Chicago Horticulture Society, and he was a distant relative of George Pullman. He loved this location here at the northern end of the Skokie lagoons, miles away from Chicago, but he had to engage in a little Chicago politics to make his dream a reality. First of all, he had to convince the head of the Cook County Board, Seymour Simon. Simon called him the most persistent man he'd ever met. Unfortunately, Simon's rival on the Cook County Board, George Dunn, didn't like the idea. Dunn said, "Who'd go there? A bunch of suburban people. Chicago people won't go there, and they're the Democratic voters." So Simon got a friend of his to convince Mayor Richard J. Daley that it was a good idea. A few days after that meeting, Dunn abruptly changed his mind.
Construction of the gardens began in 1965 and took 7 years. Designer John O. Simons said a whole new landscape was shaped from depleted fields and grossly polluted drainage ways. Since the garden opened, many new environments have been added, including the Japanese garden and the waterfall garden. The largest new project in the garden's history opened in the fall of 2002. It's the 12-acre, $14 million Great Basin and Evening Island, designed by James Van Sweden in the New American Garden style. The style is rooted in environmentalism and features perennials and native plants. Another new project is the more intimate Spider Island, inspired by dreams, fleeting thoughts, and memories, according to its designer, Michael Van Valkenburg. The one ever-present annoyance in the midst of this Eden is the Edens. Eden's Highway, that is. It runs right along the garden to the west. There's an ambitious plan to build a barrier that will make the garden sound as tranquil as it looks. The Edens Expressway was the Chicago area's first superhighway, completed in 1951. It was named for a man who never owned or drove a car, according to the book Streetwise Chicago. Banker William G. Edens headed the Illinois Highway Improvement Association way back in 1918. The group convinced the state to spend $60 million to pave the roads. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Before the Edens was built, the main highway on the North Shore was Sheridan Road. The familiar twists and turns were not originally intended. It was conceived in 1889 as a broad boulevard extending Chicago's Lakeshore Drive all the way up the North Shore. But getting all the communities to agree proved impossible. Promoters tried to get the federal government to support it as a military highway to quickly get troops from Fort Sheridan to the city. The Secretary of the Army said it was unnecessary. So today, instead of running along the lakeshore, Sheridan Road winds its way through neighborhoods and deep ravines. The first roads on the North Shore were Indian trails, and the first street signs were trail trees, like this one that now stands on a front lawn in Glencoe. The Native Americans bent the trees as saplings and staked them down to help them find their way through the forest. Often the trees pointed to water or a ridge line. This one in Kenilworth might have pointed to the busiest North Shore thoroughfare in those days, the Green Bay Trail. Today, it's called Green Bay Road. It ran along a ridge, the remnant of a prehistoric lakeshore, through the soggy lowland that bordered the lake. The 500-mile round trip between Chicago and Green Bay, Wisconsin, took a month on foot in winter. The beach was the preferred way to travel in summer months. It was smoother, and you couldn't get lost. Mail was carried along the beach until 1832, when an act of Congress improved the Green Bay Trail and named it an official post road for mail couriers on horseback. One day, in 1835, an ambitious pioneer named Anson H. Taylor trekked up the Green Bay Trail from Chicago, looking for a place to move with his wife and son. When he reached the site of present-day Glencoe, Taylor came upon what was and still is one of the most dramatic features of the North Shore, high bluffs with commanding views of the lake. The bluffs start north of Wilmette and continue to about North Chicago. Today, some of the most expensive homes in the Chicago area perch atop these bluffs with stunning views and long stairways leading down through the trees to private beaches below. If you're not wealthy enough to own a piece of the bluffs, you can still enjoy them at public parks in several shoreline suburbs, including Highland Park, Winnetka, and here in Glencoe. This is where Anson H. Taylor staked his claim in 1835.
Taylor called his 160-acre development Taylor's Port. He had his possessions shipped up here along the lakefront via ox-driven scow. Remember, Green Bay Road was pretty rough back then. Anson Taylor ran just about everything in Taylor's Port. He built a pier out there and bought a couple of schooners so he could ship lumber from the local sawmill. He was the proprietor of Lapeer House, which was an inn on the Green Bay Trail. He was postmaster, and he was justice of the peace.
But just as in Highland Park and Lake Bluff, Railroad President Walter Gurnee had designs on Taylor's Port. He married the daughter of local landowner Matthew Coe. He bought his father-in-law's 12,000-acre farm and replaced the farmhouse with this home called the Castle. Today, it's the oldest home in town. Gurnee may or may not have named the town. One story says Coe's farm became Coe's Glen and later Glencoe. Another story says Gurnee named the town for his birthplace, Glencoe, Scotland. Gurnee put the train station right in front of his house. But the Civil War economy spoiled Walter Gurnee's hopes for his Glencoe property. He sold his land to a developer in the 1860s and moved home to New York. Compared to other North Shore Railroad suburbs, Glencoe languished with dirt roads, one church, and a tiny population. Finally, in 1891, a new Romanesque train station by Charles Sumner Frost, designer of Navy Pier, signaled the start of Glencoe's long-delayed development. Frank Lloyd Wright's only known bridge is here on Sylvan Road. It was built in 1915 and rebuilt in 1985. Wright also designed 6 homes in the Ravine Bluffs development between 1905 and 1915. Another famous prairie-style architect, George W. Mayer, designed this home. The Wiebold family of department store fame built one of many revival-style homes in the 1920s. Theirs is Tudor style. Glencoe's most famous modernist building is North Shore Congregation Israel from 1964 by Minoru Yamasaki. As I mentioned earlier, Glencoe and Highland Park were open to populations that were excluded elsewhere. Glencoe has had an African-American community for more than 100 years. St. Paul AME Church dates back to 1880 and is still going strong. As I said earlier, African Americans were historically part of the service industry on the North Shore, running small retail businesses and working as laborers, domestics, and policemen. Glencoe's black community was second largest on the North Shore to Evanston. But that's not to say that blacks lived free of discrimination in Glencoe. Schools were integrated from the beginning, but beaches were not. And African Americans found they were not welcome to live in every part of town. About 100 years ago, when some blacks moved to an area on Vernon Avenue, the property was condemned by the city and turned into a park. And by the way, a similar incident happened in Deerfield in 1959. The North Shore has come a long way since then. In 1992, James O. Webb, an African American, was elected village president of Glencoe. We've already seen how the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad helped the shoreline suburbs like Glencoe develop into bedroom communities. But to the west, the inland suburbs like Northbrook benefited in a different way from a different railroad, the Milwaukee Road. These were farm towns, and the railroad shortened the time for shipping farm products to Chicago. So people started producing perishables like milk. Northbrook was first called Shermerville for Frederick Shermer, who donated land for the railroad station when the Milwaukee Road opened in the 1870s. Shermerville's brickyards flourished during the rebuilding after the Chicago Fire of 1871. This is the brook after which Northbrook is named. It's actually the north branch of the Chicago River.
So how did Shermerville become Northbrook? Well, it seems the little rural town had a reputation for tolerating drinking. So when Prohibition was enacted, the local residents wanted to clean up the town's image, and they held a contest to change its name. The winning entry came from Edward Landwehr.
Inland suburbs like Northbrook boomed as residential towns after World War II, nearly half a century after the shoreline communities to the east reached maturity. Northbrook's post-war baby boom notwithstanding, one of the town's residents invented the birth control pill. In the 1960s, Frank Benjamin Colton, who emigrated from Poland as a boy, did pioneering research in steroid chemistry that led to Enavid, the world's first oral contraceptive. Colton worked for pharmaceutical giant G.D. Searle for more than 30 years. Northbrook erased any lingering trace of its rural reputation with the opening of the very upscale Northbrook Court in 1976. There was quite a turf battle over the mall's construction. It was built on farmland bordering Highland Park and Northbrook. When Northbrook annexed the land, Highland Park sued. After losing the lawsuit, Highland Park installed traffic signals that were designed to keep mall traffic out of its neighborhoods, but also diverted Highland Park traffic away from Northbrook Court. For years, Northbrook Court shoppers were accustomed to the roar of fighter jets overhead from Glenview Naval Air Station to the south. Glenview Naval Air Station began its life as a commercial airport called Curtiss Wright Airfield. Its centerpiece was Hangar 1, the biggest and sleekest hangar ever built, designed by the famous Chicago architect Andrew Robori. The airport opened on October 20th, 1929, and 9 days later, the stock market crashed. To promote the struggling airfield, Curtiss Wright hosted air races in the 1930s. Crowds flocked there to see Charles Lindbergh, Jimmy Doolittle, and Eddie Rickenbacker. But commercial aviation never took off there. In 1940, the Navy bought the airport for a quarter of its original cost. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, Naval Air Station Glenview went into high gear. Trainees were given 3 days to practice takeoffs and landings on makeshift aircraft carriers in Lake Michigan, then sent into battle. At different times, future Presidents George Bush Sr. and Gerald Ford and space pioneer Neil Armstrong were all stationed at Glenview. With the closing of the base in 1995, the village of Glenview avoided fights with developers by developing the 1,100-acre property itself. The village named it the Glen and set out to combat urban sprawl with a new kind of land use that features lots of open space and pedestrian-oriented housing. It's a concept sometimes called New Urbanism or Neo-Traditionalism, put forth as an antidote to the suburban car culture. A land planner quoted in the Chicago Tribune said no private developer would have devoted so much open space for public use. There's a 90-acre park, a 54-acre lake, and a golf course. Concrete from the runways was recycled to transform the flat landscape into rolling countryside. The homes have front porches to encourage street life. Garages are hidden from view, and these are not starter homes. Prices ranged from $300,000 for a townhome to more than $1 million for a house on the golf course. Residents can walk to shopping and the new metro station. There's also senior housing and an office park. The $750 million development will add more than 3,000 people to Glenview's population of 39,000. There had been talk of preserving one relic from the airbase, Hangar 1, as an aviation museum. That didn't happen, but the facade and control tower were saved as part of a shopping center.
There's some land in Glenview that's simply off limits to developers. This is the Grove. It's a National Historic Landmark, and it's virtually unchanged since the Jonathan Kennicott family bought it in the 1830s and moved here from New Orleans.
Kennicott was a doctor, but his passion was horticulture. You can see why he fell in love with this place. He built his home in a beautiful grove of trees left over from the days when the Midwest was a vast forest before climate change turned it into a prairie. Kennicott's son Robert followed in his father's footsteps. He became a famous naturalist associated with the Smithsonian Institution, and he founded the Chicago Academy of Sciences.
Robert Kennicott was widely admired by the Native Americans as an herbal healer. Despite his skills, he died at age 30 on a trip to Alaska. The Native Americans there preserved his body, and they relayed it from tribe to tribe all the way back to Glenview so he could be buried here at the Grove.
On Lake Avenue in Glenview is a site that always turns heads, the last dairy farm in Cook County. Wagner Farm has been in operation since 1837. Today, the Glenview Park District runs it with a small staff and an army of volunteers.
Does anybody know how chickens grind up their food if they don't have teeth?
The last of the Wagners died in 1998, and the land was to be sold to benefit a local church. In a referendum, citizens voted to spend $7.2 million to purchase the farm and keep it operating. Cows are milked by hand twice daily. The Park District plans to return it to a 1930s-style working farm to teach about our prairie farming past. This kind of learning by doing is widely accepted today, but in the 1920s, in nearby Winnetka, it was a cutting-edge and controversial concept. School Superintendent Carlton Washburn made Winnetka a national model for progressive education. Washburn replaced grade cards with goal cards. Students learned history by building models of ancient cities, and they did independent research and held group discussions about their findings. In 1940, Washburn got a chance to design a school building as innovative as his ideas. He hired Perkins, Wheeler, and Will, who worked with the acclaimed architects Eliel and Eero Saarinen to design Crow Island School. Each room was flooded with light and painted a different color so kids couldn't get lost. Everything was kid-sized: furniture, blackboards, door handles. Each room had a bathroom and a private exit to an outdoor courtyard. The building influenced school design all across the country.
Out behind Crow Island School, you'll find the world's first jungle gym. Once again, Carlton Washburn had something to do with it.
He got the idea from Winnetka resident Theodore Hinton, who had built a bamboo prototype for his own kids. Hinton thought three-dimensional play would help kids visualize a fourth dimension.
In the end, Hinton said his kids never gave a hang for the fourth dimension, but they liked climbing around on the frame. So he and Washburn built this one out of iron pipe in their spare time. Hinton went on to market them under the name Jungle Gym.
Of all the great public schools in Winnetka and on the North Shore, probably none is more famous than New Trier Township High School, built in 1901. For many years, New Trier has been at or near the top in test scores, although in 2001 it dropped to third in state achievement tests behind Chicago's Whitney Young and Northside Prep. New Trier's athletes and teams have racked up 77 state titles, more than any other school, and the music department has won top honors from Downbeat magazine and the Grammy Awards. Famous alums include Charlton Heston, Rock Hudson, Anne Margaret, and Donald Rumsfeld. By the way, New Trier Township was named for Trier, Germany. Many of this area's first settlers were farmers from that region, like the Schmidt family from Koblenz, who built Winnetka's very first house in the 1830s on a site that was once a Potawatomi village and is today the 9th green of the Indian Hills Country Club. The house was moved here to Tower Road in 1917. Schmidt descendants continued living in it until the last one died in 2001. The house now belongs to the Winnetka Historical Society. Education wasn't the only progressive thing in Winnetka. Essayist and social reformer Henry Demarest Lloyd began setting a progressive tone there in 1878. He convinced the town council to practice his philosophies of direct democracy, and Winnetka built a municipal power plant, in part because of Lloyd's outspoken arguments against monopolies. Years later, Winnetka successfully fought off Samuel Insull's attempt to make the little power plant part of his Commonwealth Edison empire. The leader of that battle was Winnetka's Harold Ickes, who was FDR's Secretary of the Interior. As head of the WPA, Ickes was responsible for lowering the railroad tracks in Winnetka and building the Skokie lagoons. Henry Demarest Lloyd and his wife Jessie lived in this Sheridan Road home called Wayside, which they could afford because Jessie's father was the wealthy Chicago Tribune publisher William Bross. At Wayside, the Lloyds often hosted notables like Jane Addams and labor activist Eugene Debs. Lloyd and his father-in-law had a major falling out over Lloyd's support of the Haymarket anarchists. Winnetka progressives achieved maybe their greatest victory in 1965 when Martin Luther King accepted their invitation to speak on the Winnetka Village Green. King argued for open housing on the North Shore, telling the polite crowd that African Americans lagged behind due to discrimination, poverty, and ignorance. Despite Winnetka's progressive rhetoric, efforts at open housing here and elsewhere on the North Shore would be largely unsuccessful for many years to come. The Village Green, where Dr. King spoke, was donated to the city more than 100 years ago by Charles Peck, who developed Winnetka in the 1850s with his partner, Walter Gurnee. Peck's wife, Sarah, gave Winnetka its name. She said it was a Native American word meaning beautiful land. One of the most impressive homes in Winnetka is W. Clement Stone's Spanish-style lakefront estate built in the 1920s. Stone, who passed away in September of 2002 at age 100, preached positive mental attitude. He built a small insurance agency into the company that eventually became the multi-billion-dollar Aon Corporation. Stone was a supporter of Richard Nixon and a famous philanthropist whose foundation gave several $100 million to promote education and child development. This house is one of the most famous in America because it starred in the movie Home Alone, written and produced by John Hughes, who attended Glenbrook North High School. Like Steven Spielberg, Hughes draws inspiration from his suburban upbringing. He made many films on the North Shore, including 16 Candles, Uncle Buck, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Winnetka's A.C. Nielsen gave the TV networks a way to track their success, the Nielsen ratings, and the man who famously called TV a vast wasteland, Newton Minow, has lived in Winnetka and Glencoe. Minow was President Kennedy's head of the Federal Communications Commission. Kenilworth has the feeling of a royal country retreat. It was designed to be just that. Kenilworth was the brainchild of Joseph Sears, a man who made his fortune in lard. In the 19th century, the stuff was used for everything, from soap to cooking oil to lamp fuel. Sears lived among Chicago's most elite on Prairie Avenue. As a young man, he had read a novel called Kenilworth by Sir Walter Scott about a place near Warwick Castle in England. The story so captured him that he took his family there for a visit in 1883. In her diary, his wife described it as a grand old ruin.
Sears came home with one dream in mind, to move with his family to the country. When meatpacker Philip Armour bought his company in 1887, Sears retired at age 44 and started looking for property where he could build a country estate.
By 1889, Sears was building not just a country estate, but a whole country town. City planner Franklin Burnham laid out the streets northeast to southwest, so each house got sunlight. Franklin Burnham also designed the famous train station in the heavy stone style called Richardsonian Romanesque and the Kenilworth Union Church. According to the Architectural Album of the North Shore, this was America's first non-denominational community church. The streets were originally named for American authors, but Sears had them changed to the English and Scottish names from the characters and places in the novel Kenilworth. Original deeds required homes to be built to high construction standards on large lots, and there were no alleys allowed. The rules also restricted sales to Caucasians only. The Kenilworth Company provided transportation from Chicago for prospective homebuyers via a private railroad car and treated them to picnics and teas. Renowned architect George W. Mayer designed several Kenilworth homes, including his own. The eclectic exterior is a departure from his more familiar prairie-style work, such as the Kenilworth Club, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
Kenilworth really didn't like the idea of a streetcar running through town. They didn't think it fit with their image. They became a missing link on the North Shore Electric Line. Passengers traveling between Chicago and Milwaukee had to get off the train in Wilmette, walk through Kenilworth, and get on another train in Winnetka. Later, Sears got the railroad to donate a fountain and other improvements in exchange for granting a franchise.
Today, tributes to Sears are everywhere in town. There's a Joseph Sears memorial window at Kenilworth Union Church. The Joseph Sears School is the only school in Kenilworth. The famous photographer Walker Evans spent part of his childhood in Kenilworth. Even though he came from a wealthy family, he's best known for photographing America's poor during the Depression.
I imagine nothing was ever more irksome to Kenilworth's aristocracy than this little patch of lakefront land called No Man's Land. Well, today it's home to the highly civilized Plaza del Lago shopping center, but back in the roaring 20s, it was an oasis of irreverent nightlife on the otherwise very proper North Shore. Blame it on the invention of the automobile.
The story starts back in 1836 when a land speculator named John Gage bought property here. Wilmette annexed most of it in 1876, except for a tiny triangle. Some say this little patch was too marshy to be desirable. Others speculate that Wilmette and Kenilworth annexations stopped at the old section lines laid out by early surveyors who ignored topography and created a section mostly in the lake. Gage died in 1893, and for 30 years the land was just ignored. Meanwhile, the automobile was gaining popularity, and newly opened Sheridan Road became a favorite strip for cruisers. They were young and looking for fun. Most North Shore towns had blue laws, so according to author Robert Shea, No Man's Land became a magnet.
Shea writes that No Man's Land was the only unincorporated land along Sheridan Road from Chicago all the way to Waukegan, so it could develop unhampered by municipal codes. Sometime in the 1920s, Gage's heirs leased some land to restaurateurs who opened the Shack, the Pink Cottage, and the Tornado Tavern, which was in a building that had been hit by a tornado.
A few years later, investors started building nightclubs and resorts on the strip. Wilmette and Kenilworth were horrified. A local paper described the mysterious developers of the beach club Vista del Lago as Hollywood interests in Chicago sportsmen. One of the Hollywood investors was Lillian Gish. A 1,400-seat movie palace called Teatro del Lago was built in 1927 and scandalized neighbors by showing movies on Sundays. There was a modern car-oriented shopping center called Spanish Court. The Miralago Ballroom was described by one magazine as a roadhouse on the lake catering to the young set of automobiling, jazz-dancing nightlifers. Most buildings were designed in the fashionable Spanish style of the Roaring '20s.
If there was ever any pretense about a high moral character in No Man's Land, it ended with the Depression. Several of the clubs went out of business. They were quickly replaced by gambling halls and speakeasies. The neighbors proved just how much disdain they had for No Man's Land when a fire broke out at the Miralago on March 8, 1932. Winnetka and Wilmette's fire departments just ignored the call. Evanston responded, but Kenilworth cut off their water supply, and the Mira-Lago burned to the ground.
With the end of Prohibition in 1933, alcohol was sold openly in no man's land, and that was the last straw. Wilmette finally annexed no man's land in 1942 and immediately declared it dry. But the ice cream shops, fireworks stands, fast food joints, and gas stations stayed in business for another 20 years. Over time, modern high-rise apartment towers replaced the crumbling relics. The movie theater was torn down, and Spanish Court became Plaza del Lago. The Spanish style was preserved, including the original bell tower, but the shopping experience now reflects the fact that it's part of upscale Wilmette.
Wilmette is named for the family that may have made the worst real estate decision in the history of the North Shore. In 1829, the United States government gave them 1,000 acres of lakefront land free and clear. Less than 20 years later, they sold it for $3,000 and moved to Iowa.
Antoine Wilmette, that's spelled O-U-I-L-M-E-T-T-E, was a French-Canadian fur trader and one of Chicago's first settlers. In the 1790s, he lived near Fort Dearborn at the mouth of the Chicago River with his wife, Archange Chevalier, who was Potawatomi on her mother's side. Sources differ on why the government gave Mrs. Wilmette all that land on the North Shore. According to one source, it was in gratitude to the couple for sheltering 2 survivors of the Fort Dearborn massacre in 1812. The land became known as the Wilmette Reservation.
They weren't very happy here. They had some trouble with the neighbors. Antoine sued one of them for trespassing and lost. Most of all, they missed their Native American relatives who'd been forced to move west of the Mississippi after the Treaty of 1833. Before long, they moved west to join them.
When the railroad came through in the 1850s, there was no stop in Wilmette, so it remained a farm town, at one point calling itself the pickle capital of the world. Local developers were so eager to subdivide the farmland for homes that they built a train station with their own hands. They chose Waukegan Judge Henry Blodgett as a partner because he was an advisor to the railroad, and they hoped he could use his influence to convince the train line to stop there. Blodgett named the town using a phonetic spelling. The first home buyers found a fledgling suburb with dirt roads and no streetlights. Commuters left oil lanterns at the depot each morning so that when they returned at night they could find their way home. But by the 1890s, Wilmette was well on its way to becoming an upper-middle-class North Shore suburb. The western part of today's Wilmette was actually a separate village called Grosse Pointe. It was the commercial center of the German farming community we talked about earlier. Grosse Pointe supported itself with tax revenues from its 15 taverns. Prohibition closed them down, and in 1919 the town voted to dissolve and the village hall was sold to pay off debts. The village hall is still standing. It's now the Wilmette Historical Museum. As Chicago and its suburbs boomed in the 19th century, the soggy terrain went from being a nuisance to being a major health hazard. Sewage intermingled with drinking water, and outbreaks of disease were commonplace. The Chicago Sanitary District was created for no less a purpose than to drain the whole region. In 1900, they built a huge canal that reversed the flow of the Chicago River. Then, in 1908, they began digging the North Shore Channel, which went right through Wilmette. The town made the best of it, though. The mouth of the channel became a beautiful lakefront harbor, and soil from the construction was used as landfill to create Gilson Park, home of the Wallace Bowl. The 2,000-seat amphitheater was built in 1946 as a WPA project. Today it's a popular summer spot for community theater plays and concerts. Overlooking the harbor is one of the North Shore's most famous landmarks, the Baha'i House of Worship. The Baha'i faith was introduced to Chicago at the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. The founder of the faith was a Persian prophet named Baha'u'llah. He preached the oneness of the world's religions and people. Symbols of many world religions can be found in the lavish ornament. The building was designed by Louis Bourgeois in 1909. Construction started in 1920, but the building wasn't finished until 1953. The 9 entrances and circular floor plan are part of Baha'i religious symbolism. Inside, the lacy dome soars nearly 200 feet overhead. Actor and comedian Bill Murray was raised in Wilmette. He had 7 siblings. He acted in high school plays at Loyola Academy and helped pay his tuition there by working as a caddy at local country clubs. He honed his comic skills at Chicago's legendary Second City. Linden Street in Wilmette is the end of the line for Chicago's L trains. The old Prairie-style station has been restored and is now a bank branch. In days gone by, the North Shore line continued west from here as a streetcar, eventually reaching the Chicago and Northwestern tracks, where it headed north to Milwaukee. The last surviving fragment of the North Shore Line's Skokie Valley branch is the Skokie Swift, now part of the L system. It ends at Dempster Street in Skokie, where you'll find another old Prairie-style station. Plans call for it to be restored. Skokie calls itself the world's largest village, and with a population of 60,000, it really is the largest municipality in the country that uses the village manager form of government. But it wasn't until after World War II that the population boomed here. For 100 years, it was a small farm town called Niles Center. It was settled by a Prussian immigrant named Henry Harms at a place where 4 Indian trails came together. Today those trails are diagonal streets like Grosse Pointe and Niles Center. Henry Harms was nothing if not ambitious. He owned the general store and served as postmaster, constable, and drainage commissioner, which was a title of some importance in a place that would later take its name from the Indian word for swamp. He built the Lincoln Avenue Plank Road and owned the toll gates all the way to Halsted Street in Chicago. Like Henry Harms, most of Skokie's early settlers were from Germanic countries.
Anything else?
In the 1950s, Jews began migrating to Skokie from traditional enclaves in Chicago. The Niles Township Jewish Congregation held the first ever Jewish service in Skokie on May 16, 1952. By the 1980s, more Holocaust survivors lived in the village than in Chicago or any other suburb. Skokie erected a Holocaust memorial in 1987, designed by Chicago artist Bert Gast. It's inscribed with the names of 6 extermination camps, one for each million Jews killed, plus a passage from the Book of Lamentations in Hebrew and English.
It might surprise you to learn that today Jews make up less than half the population in Skokie. According to Lifestyle magazine, churches outnumber synagogues here. The Chicago Tribune called Skokie the Ellis Island of the North Shore. Just as in the 1950s, it's the good schools, the safe neighborhoods, and the affordable housing that make Skokie an ideal entry point for migration to the North Shore.
The last stop on our tour is the first suburb on Chicago's North Shore, Evanston.
Now, if you know anything about the early history of Evanston, you've probably heard that it led the campaign against the evils of alcohol. So it's more than a little funny that Evanston's first permanent building was more or less a liquor store. It was a log cabin built by Abraham Hathaway in 1834. An early historian called it a headquarters for counterfeiters and fugitives from justice, and generally speaking, a vile resort. But temperance would come to Evanston soon enough.
It came with the founding of Northwestern University in 1855. The school's founders were 9 devout Methodists, and its charter forbade the sale of alcohol within 4 miles of campus. The founders picked Evanston, then called Ridgeville, because it was well away from the vices of Chicago. In 1857, the town was renamed Evanston in honor of one of those Methodist founders, John Evans. He was a prominent physician, founder of the Illinois Republican Party, and a close confidant of Abraham Lincoln's. Most North Shore suburbs followed Evanston's lead and banned alcohol as soon as they incorporated. But Grosse Pointe, with its 15 saloons, and Niles Center, which had 6, were both within the 4-mile limit and became frequent targets of temperance crusaders. The most famous temperance crusader of all was Frances Willard, who quit her post as Northwestern's Dean of Women in 1874 and became president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. As head of the largest women's organization in the country, Willard became the most famous woman of her day and her work went far beyond fighting alcoholism. She lobbied for women's suffrage and was an outspoken advocate for women's rights across the board. She was also a labor activist and a radical social reformer. Willard served the WCTU for 20 years until her death in 1898 at age 58. Evanston's 117-year dry spell ended in 1972 when restaurants were permitted to serve alcohol, but it was 12 more years before Evanston got its first liquor store.
Evanston is one of many towns that claims to have invented the ice cream sundae as a response to liquor laws, but I like Evanston's twist on the story. Now, in most towns, we're told that because liquor couldn't be served on Sundays, a decadent ice cream concoction was served instead. But of course, alcohol was banned every day in Evanston. So to make Sundays even drier, soda water was banned because it's used in mixed drinks. So an Evanston drugstore started serving up ice cream sodas without the soda water on Sundays. Then it was the name of the confection that became offensive, and that's where the creative spelling comes from.
Today, Northwestern University is one of the most prestigious and competitive schools in the country, well known for the Medill School of Journalism, the Kellogg Graduate School of Management, and the School of Speech, now called the Communications School. Its faculty and graduates have won numerous Tonys, Emmys, and Oscars. It's the only private school in the Big Ten. As the university grew, so did the tiny college town of Evanston. Some of the North Shore's finest homes were built here. Many are in the Lakeshore Historic District. A large part of the district was once the lakefront estate of Chicago city planner Daniel Burnham. The property was later subdivided. The most dazzling of Evanston's elegant homes is the Charles Gates Dawes House, built for Northwestern University's treasurer in 1894. It's been restored to its 1909 condition when Dawes bought it. He was vice president under Calvin Coolidge and won the Nobel Prize for his plan to restore Europe's shattered economy after World War I. It's now the home of the Evanston Historical Society. A novice architect designed one of Evanston's newest showpieces, the Public Library, completed in 1991. It was 28-year-old Joseph Powell's first building. He was out of work and his wife was pregnant when he entered the competition to design the library. His impressive prairie-inspired design earned him many more library commissions. The hanging sculpture in the grand entrance is called Ghostwriter. It's so complex it looks like a rocket scientist designed it, and in fact the artist, Ralph Helmick, did collaborate with a rocket scientist, Stuart Schechter. Using a powerful computer, they positioned the 2,500 tiny aluminum objects on 900 wires to create a human head with a spiral representing creativity and imagination running through it. The head is androgynous and multiracial, reflecting the city's diversity. Evanston has the largest African American population on the North Shore. The Second Baptist Church was formed in 1870. In 1911, the first African American Boy Scout troop in the country was formed in Evanston, at least in part because white troops refused to accept black members. In Evanston, as elsewhere, African Americans faced discrimination in housing, recreation, and education. Northwestern students and others demonstrated for equal rights there. One outspoken black leader was Medill graduate Edwin B. Jourdain, who became managing editor of the Chicago Defender and was elected Evanston's first black alderman. Today, this community center is named for him. Evanston's lakefront is its most prized asset, but just beneath the surface lie treacherous shallows. In the heyday of lake shipping, the waters off the North Shore were the deadliest on the Great Lakes, according to author Mark S. Braun. The deadliest day of all was September 8, 1860, when the steamer Lady Elgin collided with a cargo schooner after midnight in a thunderstorm. The crippled schooner made it back to Chicago, but in less than half an hour the Lady Elgin sank. Survivors clung to floating debris as the storm blew them toward shore 9 miles away. But as they neared Wilmette Beach, pounding surf broke up the makeshift rafts, and many victims were drawn back out to sea before the eyes of helpless onlookers. Of the Lady Elgin's 400 passengers, 297 perished. The nearest lifeboat was 15 miles away in the Chicago River. A Northwestern University student was the biggest hero on that awful day. Edward Spencer tied a rope around his waist and swam out into the surf 17 times, returning each time with a survivor. Then he collapsed from exhaustion and was taken home to recover. In the coming years, Northwestern students would save many more lives. The government set up a life-saving station on the beach at Northwestern. In 1880, Captain Lawrence Oscar Lawson took charge of a squad of trained students there. When a ship was reported sinking, the young men hauled their lifeboat up the North Shore using a team of horses or sometimes a passing train. Then they carried it down steep bluffs to the beach and rowed out into the stormy seas. Over the years, Northwestern lifesavers rescued the crews of more than 40 sinking ships. The station was disbanded in 1915 when the U.S. Coast Guard was created. A living reminder of that perilous era is Grosse Pointe Lighthouse, which went into service in 1874. Its light was visible for 17 miles out at sea. With the decline of lake shipping, it was decommissioned in 1935. It was restored in the 1970s. Today, it's a national landmark owned by the city of Evanston, which keeps the light shining. It's a familiar beacon to pleasure boaters along the North Shore. Whether by the lake or by primitive trails, by steam trains or superhighways, the North Shore has always drawn people to it. Settlers looking for a better future, city dwellers looking for fresh air and open space, shoppers, workers, concert goers, or just sightseers looking to glimpse the lifestyles of the rich and famous. It's one of America's legendary enclaves, inspiring awe and envy. It's a humble home, and it's the American dream in the extreme. It's Chicago's North Shore.